There are people who get fired once and spend years trying to recover. People who spend months wondering what went wrong, questioning their decisions, questioning their abilities, sometimes even questioning their entire future. And then there are people like Ethan Walker, a man who got fired so many times that he eventually stopped counting, not because he was lazy, not because he lacked talent, and not because he didn't work hard. In fact, his problem was almost the exact opposite. He cared too much. He paid attention to things other people ignored. And he asked questions that made powerful people uncomfortable. He questioned everything, every process, every decision, every rule that didn't make sense, every system that seemed broken but nobody wanted to fix. Managers called him difficult. Executives called him disruptive. Co-workers often liked him. Bosses usually didn't. At first, Ethan thought honesty and initiative would help him succeed. Instead, they kept getting him shown the door. By the time he was 32 years old, Ethan had been fired from nearly every serious job he'd ever held. Some dismissals came after a few months, others came after years, but the ending was always the same: a meeting, an explanation, a handshake, and another company deciding it would be better off without him. Most people looked at his resume and saw failure. A pattern, a warning sign, the kind of person companies avoid, the kind of employee recruiters quietly move to the bottom of the pile. Even Ethan began wondering if maybe everyone else was right. Maybe he was the problem. Maybe he simply wasn't built for the corporate world. But what nobody realized, not even Ethan himself, was that every dismissal was teaching him something. Every bad manager, every broken system, every frustrating experience, every mistake made by the companies that fired him, they were all becoming part of an education no business school could ever provide. An education that would eventually help him build one of the most valuable logistics technology companies in the country, a company worth more than $6 billion, a company created by the man nobody wanted to employ, the man nobody wanted to keep. This is his story. Ethan's career didn't start badly. Actually, it started with enormous promise. He graduated near the top of his class, earned strong recommendations from professors, and landed a respectable position at a growing logistics company that seemed full of opportunity. From the outside, his future looked predictable. Work hard, get promoted, climb the ladder, build a comfortable life. The same path millions of professionals follow every year. For about 6 months, that's exactly what happened. Then came his first termination. Officially, the company called it a culture mismatch, a vague phrase corporate HR departments have used for decades whenever they want to avoid saying what they really mean. Unofficially, Ethan knew exactly what had happened. He had spent months watching shipments get delayed by a system that nobody had updated in years. He had documented the problem, built a spreadsheet showing how much money the company was losing every single week because of it. And then he had walked into his manager's office and presented it, convinced he was about to be promoted. Instead, one Friday afternoon, he found himself packing his belongings into a cardboard box and walking out of the building. The lesson delivered without words. Here we don't fix problems. We manage them quietly. Ethan didn't understand that yet. So he found another job, then another, then another. And every time the same pattern emerged. At first, managers loved him. He showed up early, stayed late, produced results, solved problems, the kind of employee every company claims it wants. For a while, everything went well. Then Ethan started noticing things, processes that wasted time, policies that frustrated customers, meetings that accomplished nothing, problems everyone could see but nobody seemed willing to address. And once he noticed them, he couldn't ignore them. So he asked questions about inefficiency, questions about waste, questions about why. Delivery windows that were promised in 2 days consistently took 5. Questions nobody wanted to answer. One manager pulled him aside after a meeting and said something Ethan would remember for the rest of his life. "You spend too much time trying to fix things that aren't your responsibility." The manager meant it as criticism. But Ethan couldn't understand the logic, because to him, everything became his responsibility the moment it affected the customer. If customers were unhappy, it mattered. If the business was losing money, it mattered. If employees were struggling because of a broken system, it mattered. He couldn't simply look the other way, and that inability to stay quiet followed him everywhere. By the time he turned 30, Ethan had accumulated an impressive collection of termination letters, enough to make most recruiters nervous, enough to make friends question his judgment, enough to make family members quietly worry about his future. At family gatherings, conversations about work became uncomfortable. Friends started offering advice. Some suggested he become less outspoken. Others told him to stop challenging authority. A few simply advised him to keep his head down and collect a paycheck like everyone else. For the first time, Ethan began wondering whether they might be right. Maybe he was the problem. Maybe every company couldn't possibly be wrong. Maybe success required learning how to stay silent. The thought followed him everywhere, driving home from work, lying awake at night, sitting alone after another disappointing performance review. It was a painful realization, because if he wasn't meant for the corporate world, what exactly was he meant for? At the time, Ethan didn't have an answer. What he didn't know was that this question, the one that kept him awake at night, would eventually change everything. Because sometimes the moment that feels like the beginning of failure is actually the beginning of something much bigger. And Ethan Walker was about to find that out the hard way. The final firing hit differently. He had spent 4 years at a mid-sized freight company, longer than he had stayed anywhere else, long enough to earn respect, long enough to build meaningful relationships, long enough to believe he had finally found a place where his strengths outweighed his flaws. He had helped reduce shipping errors by nearly 30%, rebuilt a client relationship that had been deteriorating for 2 years, created a tracking protocol that the operations team still uses to this day. For the first time in years, stability seemed possible. Then, one Monday morning, it ended, just like that. No dramatic argument, no public confrontation, no warning signs he could clearly point to afterward, just a meeting request on his calendar. A conference room, a manager avoiding eye contact, and the familiar words he had hoped never to hear again. By lunchtime, he was carrying a cardboard box through the parking lot. Again. As he loaded his belongings into the trunk of his car, he felt something he hadn't felt after the previous firings. Not anger, not embarrassment, exhaustion. A deep exhaustion that comes from fighting the same battle for years and always ending up in the same place. He began searching for another opportunity, updated his resume, contacted old colleagues, scheduled interviews, and waited. But the weeks passed, then more weeks, and nothing happened. Some companies rejected him immediately, others seemed excited after the first interview. Then the conversations suddenly stopped, emails went unanswered, phone calls weren't returned. It was as if an invisible door kept closing in front of him. He eventually understood why. Things usually went well until employers started calling former managers, until they learned about his history. Then everything changed. His savings account shrank. Bills accumulated. There were nights when he sat alone at the kitchen table long after midnight, staring at numbers on a screen, wondering if his career was already over. One night stood out more than all the others. Ethan opened his banking app and stared at the number on the screen. Then he opened a spreadsheet. For the first time, he stopped guessing and did the math. How much money was left? How much was going out every month? How long he could survive without income? The answer terrified him. If nothing changed, he had less than 6 months before the savings were gone. Less than 6 months before the mortgage became a problem. Less than 6 months before the life he had spent years building started to come apart. He closed the laptop, sat in silence, and for a moment he seriously considered giving up. Not because he lacked ideas, because he was exhausted. Exhausted from starting over, exhausted from proving himself, exhausted from fighting battles nobody else seemed to be fighting. But the next morning, the problem that had been living in his head was still there, waiting for him. But something unexpected happened during those difficult months. For the first time in his adult life, Ethan wasn't distracted. No meetings, no deadlines, no office politics. Just silence. And in that silence, he finally had time to think. Not about finding another job. about everything he had learned from the jobs he had already lost. He started reviewing years of experiences, company after company, customer complaint after customer complaint, and a pattern emerged, a very clear one. Almost every company he had worked for struggled with the same issue. Different industries, different products, different leadership teams, but the same underlying problem. Customers kept complaining that they had no visibility over their own shipments. They placed an order, and then they waited, not knowing where their goods were, not knowing if they would arrive on time, not knowing who to call when something went wrong. And the technology available to solve that problem, tracking systems, real-time alerts, automated logistics platforms, was either too expensive for mid-sized companies or too complicated to implement without a dedicated IT team. The gap was enormous, and nobody was filling it. The more Ethan thought about it, the more obsessed he became. He filled notebooks with ideas, created diagrams, mapped processes, studied competitors, and eventually one question began appearing over and over again. What if the reason nobody was solving the problem was because the people in charge had never actually felt it themselves? And if that was true, another question immediately followed. One that felt both exciting and terrifying. What if he built the solution himself? For the first time in months, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt since losing his job. Hope. Before we continue, have you ever reached a point where every door seemed to be closing? Where no matter how hard you worked, people only seemed to see your failures? Because that's exactly where Ethan is right now. No job, no clear future, no guarantee that things will ever get better. But what happens next is the reason this story is worth telling. Subscribe if you haven't yet. Every week on this channel, we go inside the stories behind the biggest rises and collapses in business. Now let's see what Ethan decided to do next. Starting a company sounds exciting, at least from a distance. What people rarely talk about is the beginning, because the beginning is usually uncomfortable, messy, terrifying, and often lonely. Ethan discovered that almost immediately. He had no wealthy investors waiting to write checks, no famous mentors opening doors, no powerful network of executives eager to help. All he had was an idea, a problem he believed needed solving, and a conviction that refused to leave him alone. So he took the risk. He emptied savings accounts, maxed out credit cards. His apartment became his office. Whiteboards covered the walls, notebooks filled with ideas piled up in corners. Days blurred into nights. Weekends disappeared. The company he was building, which he eventually called ClearPath, would give mid-sized logistics companies something they had never had before. Complete real-time visibility over their supply chain. A single platform where they could track every shipment, receive automatic alerts when something went wrong, and communicate with carriers without making a single phone call. Simple. Affordable. Built specifically for companies that were too big to manage manually and too small to afford enterprise solutions. It was a clear idea. Executing it was another matter entirely. The first year was brutal. The product wasn't ready. The market response was slow. Potential customers liked the idea, but weren't willing to pay for it. Meeting after meeting ended the same way. Polite smiles, positive feedback, no contracts, no revenue. The second year wasn't much better. Several times the company came within weeks of running out of money. One moment came closer than Ethan ever admitted publicly. 3 years into the journey, ClearPath missed a critical revenue target. 2 major prospects delayed their decisions. A third backed out entirely. For several days, Ethan wasn't sure whether the company would make payroll the following month. He spent an entire weekend reviewing every possible option. Cut expenses, delay hiring, raise emergency capital. Nothing looked good. By Sunday night, he sat alone in the office staring at a whiteboard covered in numbers, years of work, hundreds of sacrifices. Everything seemed to be hanging by a thread. Then something unexpected happened. On Monday morning, one of the prospects that had gone silent called back. The deal wasn't huge, but it bought time, and sometimes time is all a company needs to survive. Ethan would later say that many people imagine successful businesses growing in a straight line. The reality is usually much messier. Often, the difference between success and failure is measured in a few extra weeks. Ethan became painfully familiar with checking bank balances. He knew exactly how many months he could survive, then weeks, then days. Investors ignored him, competitors laughed at him. One executive at a rival company told a journalist, on the record, that ClearPath was a solution in search of a problem. For a while it was difficult to argue, but Ethan had one advantage nobody could replicate. He understood the customer's frustration better than anyone, because he had spent years living inside it. While other companies focused on selling features, Ethan focused on solving the exact moment when a logistics manager panics because a shipment has gone silent and nobody can explain why. And customers noticed. Slowly, then suddenly, the first client arrived, a small trucking company in Ohio. Nothing impressive, but it proved someone was willing to pay. One client became 5, 5 became 12, 12 became 50. Each new customer brought feedback. Each piece of feedback improved the product. Each improvement attracted more customers. For the first time, momentum appeared. The moment everything changed arrived without warning. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and Ethan was preparing for what he expected to be another inconclusive meeting with a procurement team at one of the largest retail distribution companies in the country. He had been trying to get in front of their leadership for 8 months, 3 cancelled calls, 2 rescheduled presentations, 1 meeting where the decision-maker didn't show up. He almost didn't go, but he went. And 40 minutes into the presentation, the VP of Operations did something unexpected. He stopped Ethan mid-sentence, put down his pen and said, "How soon can you have this running for our entire Eastern network?" The contract that followed was the largest in ClearPath's history, by a factor of 10, and when a company that size signs with a startup, the industry pays attention. Within weeks, the calls Ethan had been making for years started coming back to him. Investors who had ignored his emails were requesting meetings. One meeting was especially memorable. 2 years earlier, a prominent investor had rejected ClearPath in less than 15 minutes. At the time, he had described the business as too small, too risky, and unlikely to scale. Now that same investor was sitting across the table from Ethan, asking how much capital the company needed. Halfway through the conversation, he paused and smiled. Then admitted something Ethan never expected to hear. "I got this one wrong. It wasn't a dramatic moment. There was no celebration, no speech. But for Ethan, it represented something important, proof that the world was finally beginning to see what he had seen years earlier. Journalists were calling. Industry publications wanted interviews. Customers who had never heard of ClearPath suddenly wanted demonstrations. For the first time, Ethan wasn't chasing opportunities. Opportunities were chasing him, and that created a completely different challenge. Fast growth, the kind every entrepreneur dreams about and secretly fears. Customers arrived faster than the company could handle. The support team struggled to keep up. The product team worked around the clock. Hiring became urgent. Systems that worked perfectly for a small company began breaking under the weight of success. For the first time, Ethan had to stop thinking like a survivor and start thinking like a leader. Building the product was no longer enough. Now he had to build an organization. Some days felt exhilarating, others felt overwhelming, but the numbers kept moving in the right direction. Revenue climbed, then doubled again, and the irony wasn't lost on him. Many of the executives who had once refused to hire him were now eager to meet. Some wanted partnerships, others wanted investments, a few wanted jobs. The same people, who once questioned whether he belonged in the corporate world, were now asking how they could become part of what he was building. The qualities that once got him fired were suddenly being celebrated. His persistence, his refusal to accept inefficient systems, his habit of questioning assumptions, his unwillingness to follow conventional thinking simply because everyone else did. Years earlier, those traits had been labeled disruptive. Now they were called visionary. Nothing about Ethan had fundamentally changed. He was still asking questions, still challenging assumptions, still searching for better solutions. The difference was that now the results were impossible to ignore. 10 years after being fired from what he believed might be his final corporate job, Ethan Walker stood on a stage, looking out at thousands of employees. Behind him, a giant screen displayed numbers that would have seemed impossible a decade earlier. ClearPath was now valued at more than $6 billion. Thousands of employees, millions of shipments tracked every single day, operations spanning multiple markets across 3 continents, a business that had evolved from a desperate idea scribbled into notebooks at a kitchen table, into one of the most valuable logistics technology companies in the world. And as the audience applauded, it was impossible not to think about the irony, because the man standing on that stage was the same man who once struggled to convince employers to keep him. The same man who had carried cardboard boxes through parking lots. The same man who had spent nights staring at a bank account that was running out. The same man recruiters quietly avoided. Now those same qualities were being studied in business schools, interviewed on podcasts, analyzed by investors. But what makes Ethan's story remarkable isn't the valuation. It's not the headlines. It's not the size of the company. The most interesting part of the story is what happened before any of those things existed, because when people look at success, they often focus on the outcome. What they don't see are the years spent becoming the person capable of building those things. And that's where Ethan's real story lives. Looking back, he eventually realized something important. He wasn't failing all those years, at least not in the way people assumed. He was learning what broken leadership looked like, learning what happened when companies ignored their customers, learning how talented employees became frustrated when nobody listened. Every company that fired him taught him something. Every rejection revealed a weakness in the system. Every difficult manager showed him the kind of leader he never wanted to become. Every setback gave him information he would later use to build something better, and perhaps most importantly, every firing forced him to confront a difficult truth. The corporate world wasn't rejecting him because he lacked ability. It was rejecting him because he viewed problems differently. For years, he thought that difference was a weakness, something he needed to fix, something he needed to hide. But over time, he discovered the opposite. The thing everyone considered his greatest flaw eventually became his greatest strength. His inability to ignore problems, his refusal to accept inefficient systems, his habit of asking uncomfortable questions. Those qualities made him difficult to manage, but they made him exceptionally capable of building. And that's often how success works. The trait people criticize today may be the same trait people admire tomorrow. The quality that makes you feel out of place in one environment may become your greatest advantage in another. Ethan eventually stopped measuring himself by the standards of companies that never understood him. And once he did, everything changed, because he no longer focused on becoming the employee others wanted. He focused on becoming the entrepreneur he was capable of being. That's what transformed his life. Not luck, not timing, not a single breakthrough moment. A decade of lessons, failures, risks, and persistence. A decade of refusing to quit. And when people ask Ethan today how he built a company worth more than $6 billion, he usually smiles before answering, because he knows the truth sounds almost absurd. The foundation wasn't built in the years when everything was working. It was built during the years when everything seemed to be falling apart. And without those years, without every firing, every rejection, every cardboard box and every parking lot, ClearPath would never have existed. 10 years earlier, Ethan had walked through parking lots carrying boxes filled with everything he owned from jobs that no longer wanted him. Now thousands of people walked into offices around the world carrying employee badges with the logo of a company he had built. A company that existed because he refused to quit, because he refused to stop asking questions, because he refused to become the version of himself that others expected him to be. The difference between those two moments wasn't luck, it wasn't timing, it wasn't talent alone. It was a decade of persistence, a decade of setbacks, decade of getting back up every time life told him to stay down. And in the end, that made all the difference. If Ethan's story teaches us anything, it's that rejection isn't always a verdict. Sometimes it's a redirection. Sometimes the door that closes is the very thing forcing you toward a better path. And sometimes the people who tell you that you'll never succeed are simply unable to imagine what's possible. The people who judge you only see a moment, a bad year, a failed job, a setback. But your story is always bigger than a single moment, and your future is never defined by someone else's opinion of your potential. It's defined by what you choose to do next. Subscribe to Profit Peril for more stories like this one, and leave a comment. What's a rejection in your life that eventually pushed you somewhere better? I read every single one. See you tomorrow.